You had a list of things to do today. Not an unreasonable list. Not the list of someone who expects too much of themselves. Just the things. The ordinary, manageable, adult life things that need doing. And you did none of them. Not because you couldn't. Not because you didn't care. Not because some external force intervened and took the day from you. You just didn't. Sat with the intention. Felt the weight of it. Opened the thing and closed it again. Started and started somewhere else and stopped there too. And now it's evening. And the list is exactly as it was. And you are lying somewhere feeling the specific, corrosive combination of exhaustion and guilt that comes from a day of doing nothing while feeling everything. And somewhere in the back of your mind, or maybe loudly, depending on how long this has been going on, a word. Lazy. Welcome to Thought Paradox. Today we're taking that word apart, because it's the wrong diagnosis. It has almost always been the wrong diagnosis. And understanding what's actually happening, in your brain, in your nervous system, in the invisible load that nobody around you can see, might be the most useful thing anyone has said to you in a very long time.
Let's start with the word itself. Because laziness, real laziness, in the clinical and practical sense, is a specific thing. It is the absence of motivation in the presence of capacity and energy. A lazy person has the bandwidth, has the energy, has the clarity, and chooses not to use it. Not because something is wrong, but because the effort simply doesn't feel worth it. That is not what you're describing. What you're describing is different. The motivation is there, or was there, before the exhaustion buried it. The caring is there, sometimes painfully, overwhelmingly there. What isn't there is the capacity, the cognitive bandwidth, the working memory and executive function and emotional regulation required to translate intention into action. And that gap between wanting to do something and being able to make yourself do it is not laziness. It is the signature of a mind that is running at or beyond its load limit. There's a concept in cognitive psychology called cognitive load, the total amount of mental effort being used at any given time by the working memory. Working memory, despite what we'd like to believe, is not infinite. It has a capacity, and when that capacity is exceeded, when the number of active demands, unresolved concerns, background anxieties, and unprocessed emotional events exceeds what the system can hold, performance degrades. Not because you're broken, not because you're weak, because you're full. And a full system cannot take on more without something giving way.
Because it doesn't always look the way people expect. Mental overload is not always crying in a corner, not always a dramatic breakdown, not always identifiable as a crisis from the outside. Sometimes it looks, from the outside, exactly like laziness. It looks like procrastination. Not the procrastination of someone who doesn't care, the procrastination of someone who cares so much, who has so many things loaded simultaneously, that the act of choosing where to start becomes its own impossible task. When everything is urgent, and everything is weighted, and everything is connected to something else that also needs doing, the mind freezes. Not from indifference, from overload. The to-do list doesn't get shorter because the person isn't trying. It doesn't get shorter because they're standing in front of it with a system that cannot process one more input without crashing. It looks like numbing. The phone, the endless scroll, the 3 hours of content that you didn't choose, don't particularly enjoy, and can't seem to stop consuming. This isn't weakness. It isn't avoidance in the simple sense. It's the mind seeking the lowest cognitive load activity available. When the brain is overloaded,
It moves toward inputs that require nothing, that demand no decision, no output, no emotional engagement. The scroll is not entertainment. It is the cognitive equivalent of lying on the floor because you don't have the energy to stand. It looks like doing the easy things instead of the important ones. You cleaned the kitchen, reorganized the shelf, answered the low-stakes emails, did every small thing except the one that needed doing. This is not displacement activity in the lazy sense. It is the mind seeking the satisfaction of completion, any completion, when the important task is too large, too ambiguous, or too emotionally loaded to approach directly. It looks like emotional flatness. The things that used to matter don't seem to produce the same response. The activities that once brought pleasure feel like obligations. The future, which once had texture and pull, feels oddly distant and two-dimensional. This is not depression, necessarily. It is the emotional system conserving resources. When the cognitive and emotional systems are running at capacity, the brain begins rationing. It pulls back from non-essential emotional experiences to preserve bandwidth for what's critical. The flatness isn't emptiness. It's triage.
Here is the part that most conversations about productivity and laziness miss entirely. The load is not only the visible tasks, the emails, the deadlines, the appointments, the logistics of a life. Those are the visible layer, and they are real. But underneath them, invisible to almost everyone, including often the person carrying them, is another layer. And that layer is where the real weight lives. The emotional labor of relationships, the monitoring of other people's states, the management of conflict, real or anticipated, the energy of being present for people who need you while also needing things yourself. This doesn't show up on a to-do list. Nobody accounts for it. It doesn't get scheduled or tracked or acknowledged in any productivity system. But it runs continuously, consuming bandwidth that then isn't available for the work, the task, the thing on the list. The unresolved. Every unfinished conversation, every decision that hasn't been made, every relationship tension that hasn't been addressed, every situation that exists in a state of unresolved ambiguity. The mind does not file these away neatly. It keeps them open, running in the background, consuming working memory the way open browser tabs consume RAM. You cannot see them, but you can feel their weight in the inexplicable heaviness of days where nothing seems to go wrong, but nothing seems to move. The chronic anxiety tax. For people who live with baseline anxiety, the kind that doesn't attach to specific things, that simply runs as a low-grade background process, the cognitive cost is enormous and almost entirely invisible. Anxiety is not a passive experience. It is an active process. It consumes attention. It runs simulations. It monitors for threat. It processes and reprocesses potential outcomes. All of that happens alongside everything else, and the person experiencing it has often normalized it so completely that they don't account for the load it creates. They just wonder why they're so tired, why the simple things feel hard, why they can't seem to access the motivation everyone else seems to have in abundance. The weight of being perceived. For many people, particularly those who are sensitive to social judgment, the act of existing in social or professional spaces carries a cognitive overhead that others simply don't pay. The monitoring of how they're coming across, the replaying of interactions, the management of impression. This is not vanity. It is the nervous system doing what it was conditioned to do, but it costs every time, in bandwidth that then isn't available for anything else. The lazy label is not just wrong.
It is actively harmful. Because when you misidentify the problem, you apply the wrong solution. If the problem is laziness, the solution is discipline. Push through. Try harder. Want it more. Stop making excuses. If the problem is mental overload, discipline makes it worse. Pushing a system that is already at capacity doesn't increase its capacity. It increases the load. And increasing the load on an already overloaded system produces one of two outcomes: burnout or shutdown, neither of which looks like productivity. The lazy label also carries a moral charge that the correct diagnosis doesn't. Laziness, in our culture, is a character flaw. It implies a failure of will, a weakness of spirit, a deficit of the quality that separates those who make something of themselves from those who don't. And when someone who is mentally overloaded accepts that label, when they internalize it, as most eventually do, it adds one more thing to the invisible load: the shame of not being enough, the guilt of knowing what needs doing and being unable to make yourself do it, the self-indictment that runs quietly beneath every day that doesn't produce what was hoped for. All of that is additional weight on a system that was already full, and it makes everything harder, not easier. Let's be honest about this section up front. The answer is not a productivity hack. It is not a morning routine or a time-blocking system or a new app that organizes your tasks differently. Those things can help at the margins, but they address the visible layer while leaving the invisible one completely untouched. What actually helps goes deeper. Reducing the open loops. The unresolved conversations, the unmade decisions, the ambiguous situations being held in working memory without resolution. Each one you close through having the conversation, making the decision, accepting the ambiguity rather than holding it in suspension, frees cognitive resources that were locked in maintenance. You don't have to resolve everything, but identifying the 3 or 4 biggest open loops and finding a way to close or accept them will do more for your functional capacity than any productivity system ever could. Externalizing the invisible load. Write it down, all of it. Not the task list, the actual load. The things you're carrying that don't appear on any list. The relationship thing you're not sure how to handle. The financial anxiety you're managing in the background. The unspoken thing between you and someone you care about. The future uncertainty that sits in your chest without a name. Writing it down does 2 things. It removes it from active working memory, even partially, and it makes the load visible, often for the first time, in a way that allows you to actually look at it rather than just feel it. Permission to do less, genuinely. Not strategic rest as a productivity technique, not recovery as investment, just less. Because the system needs it. Because a car running on empty doesn't benefit from being driven harder. The guilt that accompanies doing less is part of the load. It is not motivation. It is additional weight. Removing the guilt, or at least reducing it, is itself a form of cognitive offloading. Addressing the anxiety at the source. For people whose invisible load is primarily anxiety-driven, whose background process is threat monitoring rather than unresolved logistics, the most effective interventions are the ones that address the nervous system directly. Therapy, somatic practices, the slow, patient work of building a nervous system that doesn't run at maximum alert as its default setting. This is not quick, but nothing else, no productivity system, no discipline strategy, no reframing exercise,
touches the real problem in the same way.
You are not lazy. Let that land for a moment. Not as reassurance, not as flattery, as an accurate diagnosis. The word lazy implies an absence of something, of effort, of caring, of the will to do what needs doing. But you have been carrying more than most people can see, more possibly than you've allowed yourself to fully acknowledge. The weight of the unresolved, the cost of the anxiety that runs whether you invited it or not, the overhead of the emotional labor that nobody schedules and nobody accounts for, the invisible tax of being a person who thinks deeply and feels everything, and cannot simply switch it off when the work needs doing. That is not laziness. That is an overloaded system doing its best. The days that look like nothing, the ones that produce the most guilt, the ones where the list sits untouched and the evening arrives before anything moved. Those days are not evidence of a character flaw. They are evidence of a system that needed rest it couldn't ask for, and a person who needed permission they didn't know they could give themselves. So here it is. You are allowed to be full. You are allowed to have a limit, to reach it, to need things to slow down before they can speed up again. You are allowed to have days that don't produce anything visible, and for those days to not become evidence of everything you've decided is wrong with you. The capacity will return. It always does. But not by pushing harder against a system that's already at its ceiling. By giving it, finally, honestly, without guilt, the space to empty. I'm Thought Paradox. If this named something you've been carrying without the right word for it, share it with someone who needed to hear it. See you in the next one.